Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating topic, Kundalini. It's this ancient idea that suggests there's a powerful, almost divine energy coiled up and sleeping inside every single one of us, just waiting for the right moment to wake up. So let me just ask you this straight up. What if there's a latent, totally transformative power coiled inside you right now? An evolutionary force that, if you could just unlock it, could completely change how you see the world, how you see everything. Well, that's the incredible promise of Kundalini. So where does the name come from? Kundalini is Sanskrit, and it means circular or coiled. But really, the most common translation is the coiled snake. And that's not just some cool-sounding name, it's a perfect metaphor. Picture this sleeping serpent, this potent, divine feminine energy, often called Shakti, just resting at the base of your spine. Okay, so to get started, let's really unpack what this serpent power is all about, at least according to the yogic traditions that have talked about it for centuries. This image here gives you a beautiful visual of the path this energy is supposed to take. You see the yogi in deep meditation, and he's visualizing the chakras. You can think of those as energy centers, or maybe even power stations, all lined up along the spine. This is the super highway that the Kundalini energy travels on once it wakes up. And that brings us to the big question, right? The awakening itself. I mean, what does it actually feel like when this powerful energy finally starts to uncoil? To even begin to understand the journey, you've got to get this core idea of cosmic duality. So on one side, you have Shakti. That's the creative, dynamic, feminine energy coiled at the root. It's the engine, the force of creation and movement. Then, on the other side, way up at the crown of the head, you have Shiva. This represents pure consciousness, awareness, stillness. They're like two halves of a whole, and the entire point of the Kundalini journey is to bring them together, to unite them. And this union isn't just a random event. It's a process. It happens in steps. First, boom, the energy awakens. Then it starts to shoot up this central energy channel along the spine, called the Sushumna. As it goes up, it pierces and lights up each chakra, one by one, like flipping a series of switches. And then, finally, at the crown, Shakti merges with Shiva. This is the moment that's said to trigger this profound spiritual liberation. But listen, this is not always some gentle, blissful floating experience. Check out this quote from a case study. It gives you a real sense of the raw, physical power we're talking about. A great spasm of electrical energy, which thrashed like a snake inside me. Wow. It's an intense, almost violent description that really tells you how shocking and how visceral a real awakening can be. Okay, so if the experience can be that intense, how do people actually get there? What are the paths that lead to awakening this energy? Let's take a look. So you can really break it down into two main approaches. You've got the active approach, which is probably what most of us think of. It's disciplined, systematic practice, things like Hatha yoga, very specific breathing techniques, chanting. It's all about actively creating the right conditions for the awakening. But then there's the passive approach, which is completely different. It's a path of surrender. Instead of trying and striving, you just let go. And a huge part of this is something called Shakti, where a guru can literally transmit spiritual energy to a student, giving them a direct taste of that awakened state. All right, so now we get to the really interesting part, the aftermath. What actually happens to people after they've gone through one of these massive, life-changing experiences? Now, here's a fascinating bit of data. When researchers started looking at spontaneous awakenings, ones that just happen out of the blue, they found a really clear pattern. The single most common age for this to happen is between 30 and 35. It kind of suggests this isn't just a random thing, but might actually be linked to a natural developmental stage in our lives. And this chart really drives that point home. It's based on data from over 100 different reported experiences. And just look at that dramatic spike right there in the early 30s. It's a pattern that keeps popping up in the research, suggesting there might be some kind of biological or psychological readiness for this kind of shift right around that time of life. And what about the experiences themselves? Well, they are very often defined by this feeling of incredible bliss. You hear people talking about a peace that passeth all understanding, or an overwhelming sense of bliss and love, or seeing a brilliant white light. The common thread here is that it's an experience that goes way beyond normal language and everyday perception. It's just on another level. But all this intensity brings us to a really critical and sometimes pretty controversial question. How in the world do we tell the difference between a genuine spiritual awakening and a psychological crisis? I mean, when you hear people describing electrical surges and radical shifts in reality, you can see why this question comes up, right? The whole experience can be incredibly disorienting, and it raises this absolutely essential question. Where do you draw the line between a spiritual emergence and a psychotic break? Well, to get an answer, we can actually turn to science. Back in 1993, a researcher named Dr. Bruce Greason did this landmark study on what he called the physio-Kundalini syndrome. His goal was to systematically list out all the symptoms and compare them across different groups of people to see if there were any real distinguishing features. And this table from his research really clears things up. With a Kundalini experience, the physical sensations often follow a very clear path, like up the spine. That intense bliss is super common. There's also this sense of witness consciousness, where you feel like you're observing yourself from a distance, and the whole thing feels deeply meaningful. Psychosis, on the other hand, usually doesn't have that clear pathway for sensations. There's less of that positive emotion, and it can often involve a breakdown of logical thought. But here is the real kicker, the most powerful finding from that entire study. When Grayson surveyed a random sample of psychiatric patients, they did not report having these specific Kundalini symptoms any more often than a totally normal control group did. This is huge. It strongly suggests that these Kundalini phenomena are not just some misdiagnosed form of mental illness. They seem to be something else entirely. So if it's not a pathology, what is it? And that leads us to our final section and a totally new way of looking at this, a perspective that frames Kundalini as something much, much bigger. Some researchers are now suggesting that Kundalini isn't an anomaly at all. They're calling it an organic process. They describe it as a natural evolutionary phenomenon, a biological mechanism literally designed for the restructuring of the brain. So, the ultimate takeaway here is a complete reframing of the whole idea. Instead of seeing Kundalini as some fringe mystical thing, or worse, a psychological problem, a growing number of people are starting to see it as a latent evolutionary energy, a potential that's built right into our biology for the sole purpose of expanding human consciousness. And that, of course, leaves us with one last profound question to think about. Is this coiled serpent not just a metaphor for our own personal enlightenment, but maybe, just maybe, a blueprint for the next step in our collective human evolution?